You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Monday evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my show. This is Scotty Roberts, and you're listening to and watching the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to hear all the audio streams, find out where it's playing on terrestrial stations around the country, and all of that. And then you can join the simulcast over on my video YouTube channel at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can join all the other Intrepids over there who enjoy this program and have become part of the family, and join the chat room, the live interactive chat room. Share your thoughts about the show, about other things, about philosophy, about anything you want. So welcome to the program tonight. And it's Monday. You know, this day over here where I am in western Wisconsin, about an hour from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area in Minnesota, just crossed the river. And it started out kind of snowy and cold. I got to tell you, it ain't even officially winter yet, which comes on the 21st of December, and I'm already tired of winter. So I'm ready for spring. Yeah, I used to like winter. And I will admit, it's pretty. It's nice to look at. I live out in the country, and so it's nice to see the rolling hills and covered with snow and all of that until you pull the car out into it, and you got to drive in it. I drive the kids to school every morning, and getting out in the morning when it's snowing and the plows are out and all of that. One thing, if you're in a different part of the country where you don't get a lot of snow, you don't understand the snow effect other than seeing it in pictures and maybe experiencing it a little bit. But here in the Great North, when it snows, the plows are out like at 5 in the morning, and they're already plowing your roads and sanding and salting things so you don't slide through intersections and stuff like that. And the highways are usually fairly clear, but you got to still be careful. And I still don't like, the older I get, the less I enjoy winter, other than to look at it, you walk around in it. I don't like driving in it. I hate going to the city, especially in the wintertime. So, it was a snowy day, and it got, but it's getting cold now. That's the thing. It's a little early for this cold. We're having below 0 Fahrenheit, for those of you in other countries. Fahrenheit below 0 weather coming up here. It started at about 40 degrees this morning, Fahrenheit. Snow on the ground, and now it's dropped to about 30 right now, and it's going to get cold tonight. So winter's coming, and it's not even here in full force yet. The dead of winter is like mid-January, which we're still about 5-6 weeks away from. And then it's going to be, you get air temperatures of minus 10 to 20 below 0. And then you get the wind chills on top of that. It's for the birds. Maybe that's why old people like to move south for the winter. I don't know. I just don't like it anymore. I don't like clearing it. I don't like you plow out your driveway, and 10 minutes later the street plow comes by again and leaves another 3-foot deep swath at the end of your drive. And so you got to go out and do that again. So anyway, that's my rant about winter today. Winter's here. It's here to stay. I don't care about the white Christmas thing. There are a hell of a lot of people in America and around the world who don't have white Christmases. White Christmas is regional. I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. You know, the old Bing Crosby song? I don't care. That was in Vermont where he sang that song, where it's snowy all the time. So let's move onward and forward. Let's get into the show today. I want to really continue this series on, it all started with, why do you believe what you say you believe, especially when you start looking into the history of what you believe, the history of the structure of your belief system, and what is your inner spirituality all about? When you say, and I'm focusing on Christianity right now, this started as an overview of Christianity segment within this bigger thing of Christo-paganism, comparing two religions, seeing if they still meld together, if there are overlaps, and then asking what we believe and why we believe what we believe. When you start finding out historical data that changes the landscape of your religion, do you say, well, my faith still upholds, I still believe the things I believe, but would you still believe them if you knew that those were created things, manufactured things within your religion to establish a hierarchy in the orthodoxy of that church? And that's really where I've come to in my own belief structure. I still struggle with it. I got to tell you, there's times where I say, God's got to be really angry at me. But then I think, no, well, is Jesus God? And I say, I don't know, really. All I know is what the history tells me of creating divinity out of Jesus, taking what was the mythic and putting it into the literal. Because we had all these God-men in the Gnostic religions and the pagan mystic religions prior to the time of Jesus. And you've got the early church fathers in the 1st and 2nd century calling all of that diabolical mimicry that Satan went back in time and raised up these other God-men type characters in order to confound the real God-man when he came in the form of Jesus. And I would ask those, if I got in a debate with some of those early church fathers, I would ask them, well, why didn't God do it differently then? If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, if he is the omnipotent being that knows all before it even began, why did he allow that to happen? When Satan is not an equal force to God, according to theology. So that's what we're looking at. We're digging into all this stuff and saying, is what we believe in Christianity simply anthropological, or is there more to this? So let's take another dive into a bit of the history about what's going on. And I think this is important for us to know and understand. We started, kind of left off last week, talking about the harmony in the difference. Harmony in the difference between Christianity and paganism. And the reason I'm focusing on paganism is because that is what was the beginnings of Christianity. The Gnostic or pagan mystical religions, mystery religions, that really comprised about the first 2 to almost 300 years after the time of Christ. And it wasn't until the church started wanting to make that literal about Jesus that the orthodoxy then started coming along. So if there's one overriding theme that we're looking at, is that what had been meant to be taken symbolically became historical. Do you understand the difference in that? The mythology versus the literal history. So the church, the Orthodox Church, morphed the symbolism into mythology, into literal history. And that's what it became. And this development cut Christianity off from its pagan roots and its beginnings and estranged it from the deeper universal meanings, or the metaphors to which myth as symbol points. Now, what does that do? Let's stop there and ask, if you were raised in Christianity, and I've asked this already a few times, what does that do to your faith life? Excuse me. That's my coffee and several carbonated beverages speaking. What does that do to your belief system? If you know that suddenly you've been given the knowledge that the things you believe maybe really weren't so, but that it was created to be that way. It was changed over from the symbolism to the literal by church leaders. Does that make it true? Is it true? Maybe it is. I have no way of knowing this for sure. You believe that in your heart. That's what your faith structure is all about, your spirituality. But changing this mindset over set up an adversarial mindset between Christianity, paganism, and other religions. And it led to turning the faith about Jesus being divine and all of this, making that literal, led to cruelties. It led to destruction. It led to needless human suffering. It led to inquisitions on all sides, all over the centuries. And it's you have to believe that Christianity needs to accept its pagan origins and the gradual transformation of symbolic myth into historical fact. One wonders how long it will be before the minds that go so toward the truth will not go the few more additional steps to the goal of full truth. That far more than were first and second centuries, far more than what we experienced in the early centuries of Christianity. And the entire ancient period was transfused with the spirit of poetic and mythic representation of wisdom. And that entire gospel content was a formulation of this nature and of immemorable antiquity. And the tragedy is that so few can go beyond the symbol to the deeper plummeting. Erroneous tradition presses so heavily in upon them that they're afraid to let go of the symbol as fact itself and reach for the wondrous grace of the miracle meaning beyond it. If Christianity were able to move beyond this fear, what then? All that energy being spent on ferreting out the historical Jesus could be freed for other activities. No amount of archaeology can ever prove a myth. And no amount of factual historical information can undo faith. Faith doesn't need a lot of the facts. I like to have facts. So here's the big question, or the big dilemma we're faced with. Is early Christianity what we had in early Christianity, which was, it was all symbolic, and then transformed in Orthodox Christianity to literal? Does that wipe out faith? Does that create faith? Is that really real? Was Jesus the one standout that was the literal God-man? Or was he just another, like all the pagan religions of the day, transformed into another one of the mystic God-men along the way? And so this is the way that there's a true deepening in the mythical sense rather than literally looking at God. The vast theological offense currently given to the majority of other faiths. And so that can be removed. And the thing is, do we want to do that? No, because it undoes what we believe. Belief is a very strong thing. Even in the face of fact, sometimes belief is a very strong thing. And this, if we could do away with that, it opens up the way to interfaith understanding that otherwise couldn't really exist. This increases the emphasis on your own personal responsibility, as it would move people away from what you could call the current idolatrous cult of a personal Jesus and into a space where everyone is expected to assume complete responsibility for his or her own personal moral struggles. And the problem with a literal historical Jesus is that most people see him as a type of celestial Superman, and that's kind of where we ended last week. We see him as a celestial Superman who will transform each of us by some remote magic and thus save us from the evolutionary task of transfiguring ourselves. And so this is stuff that we're looking at as I'm going through this series. Letting mythology be symbolic allows it to be more spiritual, as it moves away from a reliance on the literal, which is many times embodied in something material, such as words, clothing, gestures, observances, foods, colors, times of day, amulets, or relics. There was a sociologist, Richard Potter, believed that fundamentalism, as experienced today in modern day, ironically is materialistic religion. You get that? Fundamentalism is materialistic religion. Fundamentalism replaces myth and mystery and conscience with reading a book, or we used to call it a grocery list. When the focus on the literal goes away, what is left is something that's more spiritual, as you may have discovered in all of the stuff we've been talking about, these earlier topics we've been talking about, building all the way up to this point. And I'm hammering this point home. Your spirituality of mythology is what's left. So let's move on. There's a guy named Professor, Rocky's going to like this name, Vittorio di Macchioro. That sounds very Italian. He was an expert on Orphic religion, and he suggested that the only way to deliver Christianity from this imposition of turning myth into history is to transform theology into mythology. That is, to cease to consider it from a religious viewpoint as a sort of knowledge, and to treat it in the light of history of religion, as a complex of symbols by means of which man realizes his faith. And this means that the dogma concept can be replaced by the dogma symbol, which permits harmony in difference. Harmony within differences. So the shift in view from the dogma concept to the dogma symbol is the shift from the mythic literal view to the mythic global view. And it's an example of expanding concepts, ideas which we explore and will continue to explore in this series. And when concepts expand, they tend to become more universal, thereby permitting Macchioro's harmony and difference. When one can attain this perspective about what they believe and their spirituality, the door to interspiritual experience and understanding begins to open. Now, is that important? Do we have to have interspiritual understanding? I would say it this way, is that when we become less militant about believing that our viewpoint on religion, our viewpoint on what we say we believe, when it becomes less militaristic, then of course you're going to be open to including other beliefs. Is the belief that Jesus is divine, is that just an anthropological study of how mankind forms their religions and how we ended up where we are today? Was it literal? Was it mythological? So, what's out there is the examination that we're going to start getting into now. The exterior landscape of our belief systems. Looking at the issue of monotheism. That's what we're going to hit next here. This is the primary reason why any mixture of paganism and Christianity seems impossible. The monotheistic view, the one God view, versus the polytheistic view. And since the development of monotheism in Jewish history is indelibly tied together with the Old Testament, you have to look at the origins of and examine the creation of all of this stuff. So let's get into the meat today. We've got just a few minutes left, 5 minutes left in this first segment, but we're going to dig into monotheism and the Old Testament. Now this is very interesting stuff, because I've said many times in the writing of my own books that it seemed like when I was dealing with the Elohim, and the Elohim, just a very brief recap of a lesson on that word, that's the name used for God almost 3,000 times, over 2,700 times in the Old Testament. There were many names for God, but Elohim is the word used for God. That word, by definition, when you break it down, is El is the name for God, Him is the Hebrew suffix put on a word to denote plurality. So the name for the singular Almighty God in the Old Testament was a plural word, Elohim. And there are verses, you go look at Psalm 82, and you'll find where it talks about Elohim in the singular and in the plural. It says, Elohim stood in the midst of the Elohim. Elohim, God in English, stood in the midst of the divine council, which was the Elohim. So there was a caste of beings that were not angelic beings. The word angel, malosh, never appears in these passages when it talks about the Elohim or the divine council. Melohim is the plural for angels. But what we find is Elohim, which is God among many gods. That's the name of God in the Old Testament. Before you hit the name of Jehovah, which is a different being altogether. So the overview of the landscape of belief can't be completely whole without a look at the history and the development of monotheism in Western religion, which started, of course, in the Middle East. And this is particularly true for interspiritual work, since the issue of monotheism is often seen as this major stumbling block between paganism and Christianity. And of course, Christianity would tell you that Jesus himself in the Koine Greek was referred to as the scandalon, and that is the stumbling block. He was the stumbling block to force people to see that he was actually divine. He became the stumbling block to the way of the old way of thinking, the scandalon, and it was used in a positive way. And so the major stumbling block is between Christianity and paganism is monotheism versus polytheism. Who is God? Who are the gods? And this stumbling block rests on a couple of assumptions. The first of which is that paganism is always polytheistic, and Christianity is always monotheistic. And this distinction doesn't hold up under scrutiny, though, because there's some pagans conceive of the divine as a oneness or a singularity, even though it could be comprised of many gods within. It's like the Elohim, the many gods of the divine council, and the one God who ruled over them. And so this divine oneness, you believe that the names given the divine by various cultures are simply ways of describing this oneness out there. Is it really an all roads lead to Rome type of thing when it comes to belief in monotheism or polytheism? Is this polytheism? Some Christians assign power to angels, to the Elohim, to the saints, to prophets. They pray to them in lieu of or in addition to God, like Mary, the veneration of Mary, praying to Mary. When did a human woman get raised to the status of God? Because she bore in the virgin birth the child of God. And so we pray to her sometimes. She's elevated to that status. Is this monotheism? The monotheistic Christian faith, orthodoxy, teaches that you can pray to Mary, you can pray to the saints. So some pagans don't believe that God and the goddess are actual beings, but are metaphors for the creativity of the universe, which frequently expresses itself in polarities, opposites, such as light and dark, male and female. Is this polytheism? Let's get back to this because we're right on top of having to go out to the break. You sit tight for a couple of minutes, and we'll be back, and we'll hit this hard and heavy. Hey folks, thanks for sitting through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. I'm back with the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network, ODYSY1.com, to go see the network, hear the show audibly, see all the places that this show broadcasts. You can also come over to my YouTube channel and watch the simulcast in video. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Join the other Intrepids in the chat room. I'm going to do a little, if you will, little self-promotion here. Shameless self-promotion. There's a few things that I do to make a living. One of them is I'm an illustrator and a designer. I design everything from logo designs, if you will, brochures, stuff online, all of that kind of stuff, digital work, all the way down to illustration work. I illustrate children's books and things like that, all that kind of stuff. So come on over to my website, scottallenroberts.com, and it's down below here. You'll see the scrolling link to my, I don't know if it's an actual link, but it shows you the link you can type, scottallenroberts.com. And also, I do tarot readings. And if you would like to get a tarot reading, if you've joined us on some of our Sunday shows and some of the old live broadcasts that I did where we did a lot of tarot reading, you see what I do. And so come on over and go to scottallenroberts.com, click on the tarot link in the top links across the page, and you'll find the PayPal buttons there. Go ahead and click on one of those, 5-card reading or a 10-card reading, and from there we can schedule your reading. So come and do that. Avail yourself of the stuff I have to offer. What I do on the radio is what I'd love to do full-time, but I'm also an artist, so I like to paint and I like to illustrate. I like to design. And that's my bread and butter work, as well as the tarot. So come on over, grab something. Helps us put money in our coffers over here in the Roberts household, and you're going to get something good for yourself as a result. So thanks a lot. I also want to put in a good word for my friend John Penman at the Penman Hat Company. You see my hats over here hanging. He makes all the hats I wear. You want a good hat for your head? Go to penmanhats.com. One of these days, Rocky and I are going to have him on our show to talk about this stuff. We're having a lot of trouble getting that all lined up for everybody's schedules, but watch for that. And tonight, an hour after this show ends, the Rocky Stucci's Situation Room begins. And so Rocky and I will be on again tonight later. So thanks for listening, everybody. Let's move on in what we were talking about. I started talking about this monotheism versus polytheism thing. Some pagans don't believe that God and the goddess are actual beings. Some Christians don't believe that there's only one God. I started asking the question when I was writing the books, and I stumbled upon the divine council and how God refers to them with the same word that he refers to himself in the book of Psalms. So you got the God singular Elohim, and the God, and the way I've seen that described is your rabbinical schools of theology would teach, why use a plural word for the name of God, Elohim, God among many gods? Well, they said that was merely the display of the singular God's multiplicity of power and majesty. And so they would use the plural word. It's kind of like a king or a queen saying we and using plural pronouns in order to talk about themselves. We will sign that legislation. We will do this for our people, and things like that is the way the rabbinic school was expressing that. But I say, if God is in charge of making sure what man wrote down in the Bible expressed what was true and real, why would he talk that way? Wouldn't he just say, look, here it is, folks, boom, in your face? And why wouldn't he change all this stuff? We've talked about that, about the divinity of Jesus. Why is there even any question of diabolical mimicry when God could have made it differently? Because he has all the power to do that. So it's almost like God wants you to believe in him, and he's a jealous God, as the Bible says, but he throws all these roadblocks in the way to be able to actually express your faith. So there you go. Let's move on. The doctrine of the Trinity, the triune, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, divides the divine into these interdependent and co-equal pieces. Is this monotheism? We've always believed in God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The three are one, the one is three. But is that polytheism? Is that monotheism? The fact that some Christian denominations reject the doctrine of the Trinity and the veneration of the angels and the saints seems to indicate that they, at least, sense some sort of difficulty here. And so the point of these examples is to show that there is a dividing line between polytheism and monotheism that many assume solidly exists between paganism and Christianity. But you know what? It really isn't. There isn't a lot of difference. We've just, in the Orthodox Christian Church, kind of renamed that and reconfigured it. Now, if you have to rename and reconfigure the truth, was that the truth expressed in the first place? If what we believe in these structures of religion are supposed to be universal truth, why did man have to tinker with it so much? So the second assumption about all this comes from the place held by monotheism in the history of Christianity. And the Gospels, the four Gospels that we have in the Bible, out of the 70, 60 plus of which were not included in the Bible, the second assumption comes from the place held by monotheism. The Gospels present a story of Jesus that shows him to be the fulfillment of Old Testament history and a long line of prophecy. Jesus himself said, "I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it," he said. So there's many events and characters of the Old Testament that are directly linked by the Gospel writers to the life and destiny of Jesus. And a first-time reader of the Gospels might not be able to grasp all of the allusions and the references made in those writings in those Gospels, because they're references made 2,000 years ago, 1,700 years ago, during their writing. But there are all kinds of allusions and references made about Jesus without having a copy of the Old Testament at hand. So in addition, the Gospel writers, the four of them, tie the spiritual purposes of Jesus' mission on earth to the Old Testament prophecies. The salvific aspects of Jesus' life have no context without it. You can't say that Jesus was the kinsman redeemer, that he was the Messiah, that he was the fulfillment of these things without acknowledging the context of the Old Testament. So the bondage from which Christians believe Jesus frees people is the bondage begun by Adam and Eve, way back at the very beginning of the Old Testament. It was their sin that brought universal sin on man, a sin nature that we're born into. And that sin nature demanded a redeemer, a salvation. And it's even prophesied in the Garden of Eden story. After Eve takes the fruit from the serpent, gives it to Adam, and poof, they're naked and all of mankind is fallen, God renders this first prophecy, which said, he said to the serpent and to the woman, he says, and there will be constant enmity or division or enemyship, if you will, between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the humans. And he said to the serpent, and there will be a day when you will bite his heel, but he will return and crush your head. That is considered by all Christianity, rabbinic schools, with very little detraction from that, to be the first prophecy of a coming Messiah that would save a fallen race of mankind. So you can't ignore the Old Testament when you're looking at the divinity of Jesus. And so it's the story of the fall is one of the innumerable falls highlighted again and again in the Old Testament. It's this turning away from the covenant that God established, and it relapses in worship, ignoring prophetic warnings, being conquered by foreign armies, which the Bible always said was God dealing with his people, which are all followed by rescue, release, forgiveness, and regracing of the people. So in one sense, Jesus continues this story, which can be viewed as a single thread that's woven through the entire Bible, from beginning to end. In another sense, Jesus ends that story, according to the gospel writers, by breaking the pattern once and for all. It says in the book of Hebrews, written by the Apostle Paul, it says, God, who had many times through our past and through our history showed himself in all the different miraculous deeds he did and all these things I just talked about, has for once and finally spoken to us in the form of his Son, and the prophecy, the revelation is now closed. So for these and perhaps other reasons, Jesus is forever linked to the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment of the Old Testament and the vision of the Jewish history that it gives. Because Jesus linked to the Old Testament, so also is orthodoxy. Orthodox Christianity is linked to the Old Testament. Orthodox Christianity adopted the view of monotheism presented in the Old Testament and the characterizations of Yahweh, Jehovah, that are found there. And at least historically, this has been so. And we have to wonder, though, if it must be so. Is there anything in the words and the actions of Jesus that absolutely require a monotheistic view of deity, of the divine, a one-God deity? Perhaps the doctrine of the Trinity and the veneration of angels and saints bring a sort of start to bring this unease to some Christians, because Christianity has existed quite well with these belief systems in place for centuries, which suggests that strict monotheism may not be a requirement in Christianity after all. But of course, they will also explain that as being the Trinity, well, that's still just one God. It's just three different aspects, is the way they describe that. But the question is, how did Judaism and then Christianity, by extension, arrive at monotheism to begin with? In our own childhoods, monotheism was such a foundational belief that it was assumed there's one God, there's one creator. And it was so deeply assumed, in fact, that it didn't have to be mentioned or even discussed. Monotheism had simply always been. That's what we always were taught to believe. And it was springing up fully formed, and it was delivered to Moses directly by God, Yahweh, the Jehovah God, in a time so ancient that it's hard to imagine. Now, keep in mind, too, that in the Garden of Eden story, remember, it's Elohim who we're dealing with there, who was God. And after the fall of man, the eating of the fruit, the seduction by Nakosh of Eve, and giving it to Adam, and the fall of humankind, that it says, and Elohim said, let us, plural, or the humans have eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and have become like gods, plural. Let us, plural, therefore go down and also prevent them from eating of the tree of life, lest they become like us, the Elohim. It's all pluralities in there. But then Yahweh comes along as the singular God. So it certainly wasn't a belief system that developed over time or in stages, or worse, recently. In fact, it wasn't a belief system at all. It simply was the truth. It was divinely ordained, not created by kings or scribes or prophets or teachers, and therefore constituted an eternal concept, this magnificent and unassailable concept that there was only one God, a monotheistic God. These perceived qualities of monotheism add to the belief that paganism and Christianity are irreconcilable. They could never come head to head and blend. There is no blending. And that the dialogue between them is near into impossible. And these qualities put monotheism beyond the reach of debate, if you will, because it doesn't seem to share the conditions of the other belief system at all, whose construction can be more clearly observed. The polytheism there. And so there's this mysterious or this forbidden quality that surrounds monotheism, that makes it difficult to assess, difficult to discuss, difficult for it to find common ground between paganism and Christianity. And yet it has to be discussed if interspiritual efforts are to be truly authentic. And I have to ask the question there, do we have to have interspiritual efforts put at play? Is that the only reason we want to look to see if there's compatibility? So we have interfaith compatibility? We have to explore the world that created the literature of the Old Testament, especially as it concerns monotheism. In order to get to an answer of that question, we have to begin with the earliest recorded experiment in monotheism and proceed to the completion of the Old Testament as a collection or a canon of writings that came to be viewed as Scripture. In the material that follows now, and what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to present the ideas of mainstream scholars and historians and archaeologists and include opposing views to them. And I'm going to start by talking about Akhenaten. Now, first of all, I want to say there are some people who believe Akhenaten was Moses. I think that's a bunch of B as in B, S as in S. Akhenaten was a pharaoh. He was not Moses. He did not lead the people out of Egypt to the promised land. That was not his intent. Akhenaten wanted to start something new, and he delved into monotheism, the worship of the Aten, the sun. And he established a whole new city and a whole new, that lasted the length of his reign, and then it was all deconstructed at Amarna. And so Akhenaten, he was the first recorded experiment in monotheism, and it occurred during his reign. He was the pharaoh of Egypt in the 14th century, and he came. My candidate for Moses was this guy back here, this bust of Senenmut, Grand Vizier, who was Grand Vizier beneath Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, by the time he reached the age 40, and he came back 40 years later as the Moses character, and I don't mean that Moses didn't exist. He came back as Moses, and that we know in the Old Testament under the reign of Amenhotep II. Now, Akhenaten was the grandson, I want to say, of Amenhotep II. He came a couple of generations down the road. And so he was in the late 14th century. And so there's an archaeologist, David Redford, who states that Akhenaten was born Amenephis IV. And he succeeded his father as pharaoh. And Amenephis' wife was the famed Nefertiti. You've seen her bust with the long, slender neck and the big crown. And from correspondence, we know that Amenephis suffered from physical deformities. He had an elongated skull, long earlobes, a prominent jaw, narrow shoulders, a pot belly, large hips and thighs, and spindly legs. And medical experts today postulate that he may have suffered from an endocrine disorder that causes secondary sexual characteristics to fail to develop. Now, his son, by the way, was the famed King Tut. Tutankhamun was not Amenhotep, Amenephis' son, Akhenaten's son. So Amenephis' father was working on several building projects at the time of his death, and for the first years of his reign, Amenephis continued them. He completed, for example, the finishing work at the Amun complex, at the Karnak temple complex, which I've been there. It's an amazing complex of temples. And in the third year of his reign, Amenephis declared a jubilee, an unusual act, as jubilees didn't usually occur until a pharaoh's 30th year of reign. And so for the next 2 years, Amenephis engaged in building projects at Thebes, which is now modern-day Luxor. And I've been to a lot of those sites, and it's pretty spectacular. And that was the capital of Egypt, by the way, in the south. But then suddenly he abandoned all these, and he announced that he was moving the capital to an empty plain up the Nile. in Middle Egypt, and this area was a desert wasteland. It had little access to water other than the Nile River running through it, and we can imagine just how unpopular this move must have been to his subjects. And after working for several years to build a new city in this wasteland, Amenophis moved into it. Even though it was not yet completed, he erected the boundary stelae, these stone markers at its borders, and he swore an oath that he would never cross those borders again. And until the move to the new capital, which occurred during his 5th year, Amenophis' reign had been tolerant of a variety of gods within the Egypt spiritual structure. In his 5th year, however, Amenophis prohibited the worship of Amun-Ra, the central deity of Egypt. Gone. Can no longer worshipped under law. And he closed all of Amun-Ra's temples. Imagine what this did to the priestly caste and their response to it. It was tumultuous, and anyone whose name was compounded with Amun, including Amenophis himself, Amun-Ophis or Amenophis, he was required to change his name. And so Amenophis changed his name to Akhenaten, which means the beloved of Aten. And so the famed King Tut, Tutankhamun, was Akhenaten's. The famed King Tut was Akhenaten's son-in-law, and would follow Akhenaten as pharaoh upon his death. That's what it was. He wasn't the son of. And Tutankhamun came under this edict also, and changed his name to Tutankhaten, to go with the Aten, in order to comply with that. And he changed, of course, his name back. He was a young man, a young boy, when Akhenaten died, and all those superiors moved everything back down into Luxor, Thebes, and did away with the worship of the Aten. And so Akhenaten then declared that the only god who would be worshipped in Egypt was Aten, a word that literally means disk, and you see the sun disk. And Aten was a male deity, and the god of light, lifted above all humans, and the creator and the sustainer of the whole earth. And in a carving, Akhenaten says that Aten is the one who built himself by himself. So does that sound familiar? Jehovah God, the God who existed to eternity past, and nobody created him. He, in a sense, self-created. And he created himself with all his own hands, the Aten. No craftsman knows him, said Akhenaten. And notice how the theme of the only or self-begotten deity is already in use here. Akhenaten proclaimed Aten his father, and declared Aten to be a divine king, deserving the reverence due a king. And so Akhenaten states that as Aten's son, he occupies Aten's throne on earth, as his father's image in this world. And so Akhenaten alone knows his father's mind and his father's will, and only he can teach and interpret it for humankind. So Akhenaten makes himself one with the God. I and the Father are one, said Jesus, centuries later. So now Akhenaten not only closes all other temples, but he destroys and he desecrates the names of other gods wherever they appear. And Redford notes, the archaeologist notes, that this was accomplished so thoroughly that it must have taken a small army circulating through the country to bring it about. And as part of this defacement, the plural word gods was erased from inscriptions and was never used again for the remainder of the reign of Akhenaten. And few texts are left from the Aten cult. In fact, only 2 hymns have survived, and they're called the Great Hymn and the Shorter Hymn. And since these texts were discovered, scholars have been struck by the resemblance between Psalm 104 and the Great Hymn. A number of the scholars surveyed for this little exercise in looking at Akhenaten mention the similarity, if only in passing. While the resemblance between these documents appears to be more than accidental or coincidental, the connection between the two remains unclear. And there's some examples I'm going to read you from Psalm 104 and the Great Hymn. And you can find the entire text of the Great Hymn, by the way, in there's other references. You can look it up online now, but Jan Assmann's book, Assmann, references it in his bibliography. So the Great Hymn, and now, oh boy, we are just down to the last minute. Boy, I don't even want to get into this now. I'm going to have to start in the next show because we've only got 30 seconds of this show left. But the Great Hymn, Bachnaten of the Aten, starts when you set in the western light land, earth is in darkness and in the condition of death. And Psalm 104 says, you make darkness and it is night, and all the beasts of the forest creep forth. In the Great Hymn, the sleepers are in chambers, and every lion comes from its den, all the serpents bite. At dawn you have risen to the light land. In Psalm 104, it says, the young lions roar after their prey and seek their meat from God. The sun rises, and they gather themselves together. And so on this goes. I'll make a comparison of that in the next program, because we're at the end of our show tonight. There's a ton of information that's just packed with information. So be here tomorrow night. We'll expand on this. If you've got any questions, ask them. Like this video over in the chat room, over in the YouTube, and folks listening both on Odyssey Radio and here on my YouTube chat, we'll see you tomorrow night. Thanks for being here.